The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and it changed everything. Adrian Calloway did not read it immediately. He let it sit on the corner of his desk for 2 full hours while he finished reviewing the quarterly accounts for the Ashbourne estate, because Adrian had long since learned that urgency was a trap. Men who moved too fast made mistakes. Men who made mistakes lost things. He had lost enough. When he finally picked up the envelope, he noted the royal seal without surprise. He had been expecting it. The court had been circling the issue of the Ashbourne title for the better part of 3 years, ever since his uncle passed without a direct heir, and the dukedom fell to Adrian, the last surviving Calloway. The court was patient, but it was not infinitely so. He broke the seal and read the letter once, slowly, with the same expression he wore when reviewing tax documents. The message was simple. The Duchy of Ashbourne required a confirmed line of succession within 18 months. If none was established, the title would be reviewed for redistribution under the Crown's protocol. The language was polite, the deadline was not. Adrian folded the letter, placed it back on the desk, and walked to the window. Outside, the Ashbourne grounds stretched in every direction. Lawns that had been tended for 200 years, oak trees older than the title itself, a stone fountain at the end of the east path that his grandfather had commissioned and his father had never liked. Adrian had grown up running along those paths. He had also grown up watching his father destroy nearly everything his grandfather built, one bad decision at a time, until there was almost nothing left for Adrian to inherit, except the name and the debt. It had taken Adrian 11 years to rebuild the estate. 11 years of calculated choices, disciplined management, and the quiet, grinding work of turning a crumbling legacy into something stable and real. He had not done it by accident. He had not done it by feeling his way through. He had done it by keeping emotion out of every significant decision he had ever made. And now the court wanted him to produce an heir. He did not panic, he thought. His butler, Hargrove, appeared in the doorway at precisely 6 in the evening, as he always did, to announce dinner. Hargrove had been at Ashbourne for 22 years. He was 71 years old, had the posture of a man half his age, and had the singular ability to read Adrian's moods without being invited to comment on them. He looked at the letter on the desk, looked at Adrian at the window, and waited. "I will need the estate manager tomorrow morning," Adrian said, without turning around. 9 o'clock. "Of course," Hargrove said. "Anything else?" "Find out if the position in the archive is still vacant. The cataloging work. We advertised it 3 months ago, and then tabled it when the roof repairs took priority. I believe there were 2 applicants still on file," Hargrove said. "I can contact them." "Do that. I want someone in there by the end of the month. The family records need to be organized before the court sends their assessors, and I am not having strangers rummage through 2 centuries of correspondence without someone competent at the helm." Hargrove nodded and left. He did not ask why Adrian had connected a letter from the royal court to the archive position, because Hargrove was too clever to ask questions whose answers he had already worked out. Adrian turned back to the grounds and let himself think plainly about what the letter meant. He needed an heir. To have an heir, he needed a suitable partner. To find a suitable partner, he needed to open the estate to a certain kind of social interaction he had spent most of his adult life carefully avoiding. He was 34 years old. He was not naive about what the court expected, or what it would take. He had simply not expected the timeline to arrive this soon. He had also, privately, hoped it would not arrive at all. This was not because Adrian was opposed to family. It was not even because he was particularly opposed to marriage in the abstract. It was because Adrian Calloway had exactly one experience with the idea of building something personal with another person, and that experience had ended in a way that had made him decide, at the age of 26, that such things were not worth the cost. He did not think about that often. He had become very good at not thinking about it. He went to dinner, ate alone as he always did, and spent the evening going over the estate's legal documents. By the time he went to bed, he had made 3 decisions. First, he would meet with the estate manager and begin a quiet, structured process of identifying appropriate candidates, women of good standing, who understood what a Calloway marriage would and would not involve. Second, he would prepare the estate for the social functions that process would require, beginning with the autumn gala, which he had cancelled the previous 2 years and could no longer afford to avoid. Third, He would not allow any of it to become complicated. He was very good at keeping things uncomplicated. He fell asleep telling himself that. The estate manager, a sharp and efficient man named Gerald Fenn, arrived at 9 o'clock sharp the next morning. Fenn had managed the practical operations of Ashbourne for 6 years, and had the professional tact of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything a Calloway asked of him. Adrian explained the situation plainly. Fenn listened, took notes, and asked 4 precise questions. By the end of the hour, they had a framework, a list of suitable families to approach through proper channels, a timeline for the autumn gala, and a set of criteria that Adrian outlined without embarrassment, because embarrassment required caring what someone thought of you, and Adrian had learned to be selective about that. Fenn left. Hargrove arrived. Adrian told him to move forward with the archive applicants. 2 days later, Hargrove placed a single resume on Adrian's desk. One of the original applicants withdrew, Hargrove said. The other is available to start within the fortnight. Her credentials are quite strong. 8 years of archival work, 2 of them with a private estate in the north, and a letter of recommendation from a university professor, whose name I recognize from your own library shelves. Adrian read the resume without sitting down. The applicant's name was Alara Voss. She was 28 years old. She had studied historical documentation at a good university, had worked in 3 different archival settings, and had a list of skills that was, by any measure, exactly what Ashbourne's records room required. Her cover letter was direct, specific, and free of the kind of performative enthusiasm that Adrian found exhausting in most correspondence. She stated what she could do, why the position suited her background, and what she expected from the role in terms of access and working conditions. He approved it. Hargrove sent the offer that afternoon. Alara Voss accepted the following morning. What Adrian did not know, what no one at Ashbourne knew, was that Alara Voss had accepted the position not because it was her first choice, or even her second, but because she needed the money, with an urgency that she had not allowed herself to fully acknowledge until the moment the offer arrived in her inbox, and she felt something very close to relief loosen in her chest. Her younger sister, Clara, had been diagnosed with a serious illness the previous winter. The treatment was available. The treatment was also expensive, in a way that Alara's savings, carefully built over 8 years of modest archival salaries, was not going to cover. She had already taken a loan. She had already sold things she valued. She had already done everything she could think of, and it was still not enough. The Ashbourne position paid well, offered room and board, and came with a 6-month contract that, if extended, would give her enough to clear the debt entirely, and have something left over to keep Clara comfortable through the recovery period. Alara took the position with both hands and held on. She also had a secret. She had known about it for 10 weeks by the time she signed the contract. She had sat in a small clinic on a gray Tuesday morning and heard the news and felt the world reorganize itself around a fact she had not been prepared for. The man who had given her that fact, a man named Owen, whom she had known for 7 months and trusted more than she should have, had heard the news 3 days later and chosen, without drama or explanation, to simply stop returning her calls. She did not cry about Owen for long. She had cried about him when he first disappeared, in the privacy of her small apartment, for exactly 4 days. Then she had stopped, not because she was not hurt, she was, but because she had too many other things to handle, and grief, she had learned a long time ago, was something you had to schedule, or it would take over entirely. By the time she accepted the Ashbourne position, she was 13 weeks along. The timeline was manageable. She was not yet visibly showing, or at least not in any way that a well-chosen wardrobe could not handle. She had calculated everything carefully. 6 months. She would do the work, earn the money, and be gone before anything became obvious. She had no intention of involving the estate, its staff, or its cold, reclusive duke in any part of her private situation. She packed her things into 2 bags and a box of reference books, arranged for a neighbor to check on Clara twice a week, and drove to Ashbourne on a damp October morning, with the radio on and her hands steady on the wheel. Ashbourne Manor appeared around the bend of the approach road like something out of a history book. Stone walls, high windows, a formal garden that had been kept with the kind of precision that suggested someone cared deeply about order. It was bigger than the photographs had suggested. It was also, she noticed immediately, very quiet. She was met at the door by Hargrove, who welcomed her with the kind of measured courtesy that made her feel she had passed some unspoken inspection. She was shown to her room, a well-proportioned space on the second floor of the east wing, with a window overlooking the herb garden, and given a tour of the archive rooms by a young assistant named Peter, who was enthusiastic and slightly nervous and spoke very quickly about the state of the existing catalog. She spent her first afternoon in the archive, alone, running her hands along the shelves and getting the measure of the task. It was significant. The records went back nearly 2 centuries, spanning correspondence, land deeds, military records, household accounts, and family documents that had been filed with varying degrees of care by varying generations of Callaways. Some of it was beautifully organized. Large portions of it were not. She felt, for the first time in months, genuinely interested in something. She stayed until the light faded from the tall archive windows, making notes in a small green notebook she always carried, mapping out the scope of the work and the order in which she would approach it. When she finally left the room and walked down the corridor toward the main staircase, she nearly walked directly into someone coming from the other direction. She caught herself against the wall. The person across from her stopped too. He was tall, with dark hair that was just beginning to show the first threads of gray at the temples, and he was wearing a jacket that was well made and slightly in need of pressing, which struck her as an interesting contradiction. He looked at her with the expression of someone who had not expected to encounter anyone in this corridor and was not particularly pleased about it. She recognized him from the estate's public records, which she had researched before accepting the position. Adrian Callaway, Duke of Ashbourne, looked exactly like his official portrait, except for the fact that in real life he appeared considerably less comfortable with being observed. "You are the archivist," he said. It was not quite a question. "Alara Voss," she said. "Yes, I arrived this morning." He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she could not read. Then he gave a single short nod. "The Fen correspondence is in the East Cabinet, second shelf. Do not reorganize the military records without showing me your proposed system first. Those documents are in a particular order that looks like disorder but is not." She blinked. "All right. Dinner is at 7. Staff eat together on weekdays. You are not required to attend, but Hargrove will think you are avoiding people if you do not, and he will worry about it for longer than either of us would like." Then he walked past her down the corridor and disappeared around the corner. Alara stood there for a moment, staring at the empty hallway. Then she wrote in her notebook, "Military records, East Cabinet, second shelf. Not as disorganized as it appears. Do not assume." She had the feeling, not entirely comfortable, that the Duke of Ashbourne was not either. She went to dinner at 7, sat at the long table in the staff dining room with Hargrove and Peter and a housekeeper named Francis, and 2 groundsmen whose names she immediately forgot. Ate the very good soup, and answered questions about her previous work, with the calm precision of someone who had learned that people trust you more when you say less. That night, in her room, with the window cracked open to the October air, she sat on the edge of the bed and pressed one hand against her stomach, very gently, and reminded herself of the plan. 6 months. Do the work. Earn the money. Leave quietly. She was very good at plans. She told herself it would hold. Downstairs, in the study that smelled of old paper and lamp oil, Adrian Callaway read through the letters Gerald Fenn had sent. Early responses from 3 families who had, through various social channels, been made gently aware that the Duke of Ashbourne was reconsidering his public engagements. All 3 responses were favorable. All 3 responses were also, reading between the lines, fairly transparent about what they hoped such renewed engagement might mean for their daughters. He put the letters in the appropriate folder and poured himself a small glass of water, because he rarely drank anything else in the evenings, and he thought about Alara Voss standing in the corridor with her small green notebook and her completely unsurprised expression. She had not been impressed by him. He had noticed that immediately. Most people, upon meeting him for the first time, did one of 2 things. They became over-polite in a way that was essentially a kind of fear, or they became performatively relaxed in a way that was essentially a kind of audition. She had done neither. She had simply looked at him as though he were a piece of information she was adding to a file. He found it, he admitted to himself in the privacy of his own mind, mildly interesting. Then he closed the folder, turned off the lamp, and went upstairs to bed. Outside, the Ashbourne grounds settled into the deep quiet of late October. The fountain at the end of the east path ran softly in the dark. The oak trees stood where they had stood for 100 years. And two people, both carrying more than anyone around them knew, slept under the same roof and thought, each in their own way, that they had the situation entirely under control. They were both wrong, but it would be a little while yet before either of them understood that. The first week passed with the clean, focused energy of someone who had arrived with a purpose. Alara worked long hours in the archive rooms, organizing her approach into careful phases, cataloging existing labels before touching anything, and building a map of the collection that would guide every decision after it. She was thorough in a way that was almost physical, methodical, unhurried, precise. Peter, the young assistant, observed this with visible admiration and the slight anxiety of someone who had previously been doing the cataloging himself, loosely, and was now wondering if his loosely had been showing. She was kind to him. She did not point out the gaps. She simply began, quietly and without fanfare, to fill them. The Duke did not appear in the archive that first week. She was aware of his presence in the estate, the way you become aware of weather, not by seeing it directly, but by the way other things responded to it. Hargrove moved with slightly more efficiency on days when Adrian was in the main building, rather than out on the grounds. Peter lowered his voice in the corridors near the study. Francis, the housekeeper, did not knock on doors without pausing first. Alara noted all of this without judgment. A man who ran a large estate, with the kind of discipline that had rebuilt it from near ruin, would naturally set the temperature of the space around him. She understood discipline. She respected it. She simply had no intention of letting it affect how she did her work. She was reorganizing the household accounts from the 1890s, on a Thursday morning, when the archive door opened and the Duke stepped inside. He did not knock. She noticed that. He also did not announce himself. He simply walked to the east cabinet, pulled out the second shelf drawer, removed a particular folder, and opened it on the table near the window, with the ease of someone who had done exactly that many times before. She kept working. After several minutes, he said, without looking up, "You have moved the 1930s correspondence." "I consolidated it," she said. "It was split across 3 cabinets, for no archival reason I could identify. I kept the existing labels, and cross-referenced them in the catalog log." A short pause. "Which cabinet?" "North wall, middle section, 3rd drawer. I made a note on the index card in the original location." Another pause, slightly longer. "All right." She kept working. He read through the folder he had retrieved. After 20 minutes he replaced it, left without comment, and closed the door quietly behind him. Peter appeared 5 minutes later, slightly wide-eyed. Did he say anything? "He asked about a folder," Alara said. "He never comes in here. He came in today." Peter looked at the door as though it had done something unexpected. Was he pleased? "He never looks pleased, but there are degrees." Alara considered. "He said all right." Peter nodded slowly, as though that meant something significant. "That is good," he said. "When he just leaves without saying anything at all, that is the bad version." She filed this information in the same way she filed everything, carefully, in case it became useful later. The second time the Duke came to the archive was the following Monday, and he came with an objection. He walked in at 10:30, looked at the table where she had laid out a sequence of military correspondence from the 1940s that she was preparing to digitally index, and stopped. "Those are not in the right order," he said. "They are in chronological order," she said, "by postmark." "They are in the wrong order," he said again, and came to stand at the other side of the table. He was close enough that she could see the faint line between his brows that appeared when he was focused on something with intensity. He picked up 2 of the letters. This one was written before this one. The postmark on the second is earlier, but the letter references events described in the first. My grandfather wrote ahead and sent the second letter by a different route. The family has always known to sequence by content, not by postmark. She looked at the letters. She looked at him. "That is not documented anywhere in the archive," she said. "It was not necessary to document it, because the family knew. The family did not hire me to interpret undocumented organizational logic," she said, keeping her voice even. "They hired me to build an archival system that another person could understand and continue after I leave. If the sequencing depends on insider knowledge, it will break down the moment that knowledge is no longer available." He looked at her with the expression of someone who had received an argument they had not expected, and were now deciding whether or not it was valid. She held his gaze without flinching, because she had worked in archives for 8 years, and had spent a significant portion of that time defending sensible methodology to people who believed that tradition and system were the same thing. "You have a point," he said finally, as if the words cost him something. "Thank you," she said. "If you can give me a list of any other sequences that follow family knowledge rather than standard dating, I will document them properly, so the logic is preserved and accessible." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the air of someone who had decided to be practical about a thing he had not expected to be practical about, he pulled out the chair across from her, sat down, and began going through the letters on the table one by one. They worked like that for 2 hours. He corrected 3 more sequences, and explained the reasoning behind each one, with the careful, slightly reluctant precision of a man who was used to knowing things, and less used to being asked to share them. She listened, asked specific questions, took notes in her green notebook, and thanked him at the end, without excessive warmth, but with clear sincerity. When he left, something in the air of the archive room was subtly different. She could not have said what it was, exactly, only that the room felt less empty than it usually did when someone was gone. She told herself it was because 2 people produce more work than one. She told herself a lot of things that month. The gala preparation began in the 3rd week of October, and Ashbourne changed with it. A team of event coordinators arrived from the city. The main hall, which had been the quiet province of Hargrove and the cleaning staff, was suddenly full of people measuring and planning. The guest list was managed by a woman named Diana, who worked for a private social events firm and had the efficiency of someone who organized complicated gatherings professionally, and the social instincts of someone who noticed things people did not mean to show. Diana met Alara on the 3rd day of preparation, in the corridor outside the archive, and assessed her with the swift, pleasant evaluation of someone who was always cataloging people.
"You are the archivist," she said. "The Duke mentioned you." Alara found this mildly surprising and did not show it.
"Did he?" "He said you had reorganized the military correspondence, and that it was sensibly done," Diana said, with the tone of someone reporting something significant. "He does not often volunteer opinions about staff." Alara went back into the archive, and sat with that for a quiet moment, before getting back to work. Downstairs, in the meeting with Gerald Fenn and Diana, Adrian was reviewing the guest list with the composed attention he brought to everything, noting names and making occasional comments that Diana wrote down, and Fenn processed into logistics. The families on the list included 3 whose daughters had been the subject of the quiet preliminary outreach, a fact that Adrian had communicated to Fenn but not to Diana, whose job was social coordination and not matrimonial strategy. He was not embarrassed about the purpose of the outreach. He was simply private about it. There was a difference. Gerald Fenn brought up the subject obliquely near the end of the meeting, noting that 2 of the 3 families had confirmed attendance with notably large parties, which he found, he said carefully, significant. Adrian acknowledged this without expression. Diana looked at her clipboard and said nothing, which meant she had already worked it out. That evening, Hargrove brought a small note to the archive where Alara was still working at 7:15. The note was from the Duke. It said, in handwriting that was precise and slightly angular, that staff were not required to attend the gala, but were welcome in the servants' hall during the event, and that he thought she should know the estate would be louder than usual for approximately 3 days. She looked at the note for a moment. She wrote a brief acknowledgement and handed it back to Hargrove. In her room that night, she stood in front of the mirror and looked at herself plainly. Her clothes still fit in a way that was comfortable, rather than obvious. She was entering her 16th week, and she felt well. Tired in the particular way that had become familiar, but well. She had a system of careful dressing and careful posture that she maintained without much effort now, because she had been maintaining it for weeks and it had become habit. She was also, she realized with a quiet, complicated feeling, that she did not examine too closely, beginning to think of Ashbourne as something other than a temporary arrangement. She shut that thought down with the same efficiency she brought to everything else. She pressed her hand briefly against her stomach, the way she did each night, and thought about Clara. Clara, who had sounded stronger in their last phone call. Clara, who had laughed at something Alara said, and the laugh had been genuine and full, not the careful laugh of someone managing pain. That was why she was here. That was all. She got into bed, turned off the light, and did not dream of portrait galleries or angular handwriting, or 2 hours spent at a long table in a room full of old letters, working alongside a man who had said all right, as though it meant something. She did not dream of that at all. She woke at 6, as she always did, and went back to work. The morning the Duke and the archivist argued properly for the first time, neither of them could have said afterward how it started. That was perhaps what made it different from the earlier disagreement about the military correspondence, which had a clear beginning and a clear end, and a practical resolution. This was something else entirely. It had started, as far as Alara could reconstruct it, with a single letter from the 1880s, a piece of correspondence written by the second Duke of Ashbourne to a land official, regarding the reallocation of farming plots on the eastern boundary of the estate. She had found it misfiled under household accounts, which was where it clearly did not belong, and had moved it to the land records section, which was where it clearly did. Adrian had come into the archive on that Wednesday morning, gone to the household accounts shelf with some purpose, found the misfiled location empty, looked at the index card she had left noting the relocation, and walked to the land records section to retrieve it. He had then stood with it open in his hands for a moment before saying, with his back still to her, "You moved the Hanley letter." "It was miscategorized," she said. "It belongs in land records." "It belongs in household accounts," he said, turning around. "That letter is referenced by 2 others in that section that I have consulted together for the past 4 years. If you remove it from that context, the administrative logic of those files collapses." "That is not archival logic," she said, setting down her pen. "That is personal habit. Archives are organized by content category, not by the convenience of one particular reader's research pattern. This is not a public archive," he said. "It is a private estate collection. The purpose of the organization is to serve the people who use it, not to satisfy an academic classification system." "The purpose of any organized system," she said, getting to her feet, "is to make information findable by anyone who needs it, not just by the person who last touched it. What you are describing is not organization, it is memorization. Those are not the same thing." He looked at her with an expression that was sharp and alive, in a way she had not seen on his face before. Not anger, exactly, something more alert than anger. "Are you telling me how the management of my own estate records should be conducted?" "Yes," she said. "You hired me to do that." A silence fell that was not quite comfortable, and not quite uncomfortable. It was charged with something that she recognized, after a moment, as the energy of 2 people who were each used to being right, and were now in the same room. "The letter stays in land records," she said. "I will create a cross-reference notation in the household accounts section that directs any reader to its new location. You will be able to find it exactly as easily as before. You will simply have to look in the right place for it." He said nothing. "I will also note," she continued, because she had momentum, and she rarely stopped once she had it, "that the system I am building is designed to be understood without explanation. When you are no longer here to remember where things are, whoever comes after you will be able to work with this collection without losing half their research time to a misfiling pattern that was never recorded." That last sentence landed differently. She saw it in the slight shift of his expression, something that moved across his face and was gone before she could name it. "Fine," he said. She nodded, sat back down, and picked up her pen. He did not leave. She was aware of him still standing there, in the way that she had become aware of his presence in rooms, a particular quality of stillness that was not passivity, but something more like concentration. "You research the succession implications," she said, without looking up. "That is why you review those files together. The Hanley letter establishes the original boundary conditions of the eastern plots, and the 2 household letters you are cross-referencing deal with subsequent disputes that only make sense in light of that original boundary." A pause. "Yes. Then I will create a research path notation in both sections that connects them explicitly. A reader following the household letters will be directed to the Hanley letter and back. The logic will be preserved." Another pause, longer this time. "That would be acceptable." She wrote something in her notebook. He stayed another few minutes, looking at the shelves. Then he said, without preamble, "There are 6 more groupings like that one. Documents that are categorically misfiled, but have been used in grouped research for long enough that separating them would break the reading pattern." She looked up. "Write them down for me." He crossed the room, took the spare chair at the end of the table without asking, and sat. She slid her notebook toward him. He wrote in his precise, angular hand for approximately 10 minutes, listing each grouping and the research logic connecting them. She read the list when he handed it back. She nodded. She put the notebook in the drawer where she kept her working documents. "Thank you," she said. He looked as though he had expected something other than that and was not entirely sure what to do with the fact that he had not received it. "The gala is in 12 days, he said, which had nothing to do with archives. "Hargrove mentioned it," she said. "The main floor will be inaccessible for most of that week. If you need anything from the study shelves during that period, you should retrieve it before the preparation begins." "I will do that," she said. He nodded once and left. This time he closed the door quietly, the way someone does when they are trying not to disturb something. She sat still for a moment after he was gone. She had been in many archives. She had worked alongside many people, academics, estate managers, curators, private collectors. She had learned, over 8 years, to read the people she worked with the way she read documents, carefully, without assumption, looking for the logic beneath the surface. The Duke of Ashbourne was not what she had expected. She had expected someone cold in the way that some wealthy, powerful people were cold, dismissive, automatic in their authority, uninterested in being questioned. What she had found instead was someone who was precise, yes, and controlled, yes, and not particularly warm in any obvious way. But there was intelligence underneath the control that was genuine rather than performed, and there was something else, a quality she was still trying to name, that made her feel, when he was in the same room, like she was being paid attention to. Not observed, not assessed. Paid attention to. She found it, she admitted privately, more interesting than she had meant to find anything here. She also found it inconvenient, and she closed that thought with the same practiced efficiency she had been using on inconvenient thoughts for months. She pulled out the cross-reference notebook and began drafting the notation system for the 6 misfiled groupings. She worked until 7. She ate dinner in the staff room. She answered Peter's questions about the 3rd cabinet section, with the patience she always brought to things that mattered. She went upstairs, called Clara, heard her laugh twice during the call, said goodnight with genuine warmth. She did not think about the way the Duke had sat down without asking, as though he simply expected there to be room for him. She did not think about his handwriting, or the list he had made. She did not think about the word acceptable, or the way he had said it, or what it might mean coming from someone who did not appear to say things casually. She slept. The next morning she retrieved the documents she would need from the study, before the preparation teams arrived. She did not ask for permission. The portrait gallery was the oldest part of Ashbourne. It ran along the inside wall of the west wing, a corridor about 40 meters long, lit during the day by high windows, and at night by lamps placed at careful intervals. Every Duke of Ashbourne for 200 years looked out from their frames in that corridor, and every duchess beside them, and various children and cousins and notable relatives who had been considered important enough to paint and hang and remember. Alara had walked through it once in her first week, briefly, as part of her general orientation to the estate. She had paused at a few portraits the way anyone does, noting the dates, the styles, the slow evolution of clothing and expression across 2 centuries. She had not lingered. She had work to do. She went back on a Thursday evening in her 4th week, for a reason she had not entirely articulated to herself. She had been working on the family correspondence for the 1940s that afternoon, and had encountered, in a series of letters between the 4th Duke and his wife, a quality of feeling that surprised her. The letters were not dramatic. They were not particularly eloquent. They were the ordinary letters of 2 people managing a household and a family and a title during a difficult period in history. But they were written with a kind of attentiveness, a noticing of small things, a care in describing the ordinary, that she found unexpectedly moving. She had found herself wondering what the 4th Duke had looked like, whether his expression in his portrait held any trace of what she had read in those letters. So she went back to the gallery. She found him about 2/3 of the way along, a serious-faced man in his 40s, well-dressed, with dark eyes that gave away nothing obvious. But there was something in the set of his mouth that she recognized from the letters, a restraint that was not coldness, a steadiness. She looked at it for a long time. She had not heard Adrian come in. She became aware of him gradually, as she always did, the particular quality of the air when he was present. She looked down the gallery, and he was standing about 10 meters away, looking at a portrait she could not quite see from her angle. She did not say anything. Neither did he, for a long moment. Then she said, "The fourth Duke. I have been reading his correspondence this week." "My great-great-grandfather," Adrian said. He walked forward slowly, until he was standing a few meters away from her, looking at the same portrait. "He was a very attentive letter writer," she said. "Not literary, but attentive. He wrote to my great-great-grandmother every day when he was away from the estate," Adrian said. "He kept that up for 43 years. She looked at the portrait again. "I did not find all of those letters, only the ones from the war years. Are the others in the collection?" "Some of them. Others were kept by the family privately, and are in a box in the upper archive, not yet catalogued." "I will find them," she said. He did not answer immediately. He was looking at the portrait with an expression she could not fully read from where she stood, but there was something in it that was quieter than his usual composed attention. She looked further along the gallery. She stopped at the portrait of a woman she had not noticed before, positioned slightly apart from the others, near a window, as though placed there deliberately. She was perhaps 30 in the portrait, with dark hair and a careful expression that was not unhappy exactly, but contained. "Who is this?" Elara asked. Adrian did not answer for a moment. "My mother," he said. She looked at the portrait more carefully. The woman in it was beautiful, in the way certain people are, not in spite of their seriousness, but because of it. There was something familiar in the face, the jaw perhaps, or the steadiness of the gaze. "She looks like someone who made decisions very carefully," Elara said. Another pause. Longer. "She did," Adrian said. "She made every decision carefully. She had to." He stopped. Then, as though the words had simply found a way out before he had decided to say them, he said, "My father was not careful. About anything. She spent most of her life managing the damage." Elara turned slightly to look at him. He was still looking at the portrait. His expression was not distressed. It was more like the expression of someone who had picked up something heavy and was simply acknowledging the weight. "I read something in the household accounts," she said carefully. "From the late 1990s. The estate finances went through a very difficult period." "They did," he said. "She managed that too, quietly, without help from anyone who should have provided it." "Where is she now?" Elara asked. "She died when I was 22, he said, before I had begun to understand most of what she had been carrying." The gallery was quiet. Outside the high windows, the late afternoon light was deepening toward dusk. "I am sorry," Elara said, and she meant it without elaboration. He glanced at her then, briefly, the way someone does when they have received something they did not expect and are not quite sure where to put it. "The fourth Duke," he said, changing direction the way she had noticed he did when something became more personal than he intended, "is why the military correspondence is sequenced the way it is. He was in the habit of writing multiple letters and dating them by anticipated receipt, not by composition. It was a habit his sons inherited to varying degrees. That makes sense of several things I could not account for," she said. "I should have explained it at the beginning," he said, "instead of waiting until you had already moved things." She almost smiled. "Yes," she said, "you should have." He looked at her with an expression that was briefly, unexpectedly, almost wry. "I am not accustomed to explaining myself. I had noticed." They stood in the gallery for another few minutes, not quite together and not quite apart, looking at 2 centuries of Callaways looking back at them. Eventually he said he had to get back to the correspondence that Fen had sent over, and she said she had 2 more sections to finish before the gala preparations took over the main floor. They walked back toward the main building separately, not together, in the natural way of 2 people who happened to be moving in the same direction. Hargrove was in the corridor as they came back into the main building. He looked at them both without visible expression, because Hargrove's expressions were very well controlled. Then he asked if either of them required anything before dinner. Elara said no and went upstairs. Adrian said no and went to the study. Hargrove went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and allowed himself, in the privacy of the kitchen, one very small and private thought that he had been having in various forms for the past 2 weeks. He did not act on it, because it was not his place. He simply had it, and put it away, and made the tea. That evening, in her room, Ilara did something she had not done before. She took out the small photograph she kept in the inner pocket of her bag. A photograph of herself and Clara from the previous spring, taken on a walk, both of them laughing at something the photographer had said. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about the portrait in the gallery. She thought about 43 years of daily letters. She thought about what it meant to notice things, small things, ordinary things, with such consistency that the noticing became its own kind of love. She pressed her hand against her stomach. She thought about Clara. She thought about the money. She thought about Owen, briefly and without particular emotion, the way you think about a closed door. She thought about standing in a quiet gallery and saying, "I am sorry," to a man who carried his history the way she carried hers, and seeing the look on his face when he received it. She put the photograph away. She turned off the light. Outside, the October night settled over Ashbourne, and the fountain at the end of the east path ran softly in the dark, and somewhere in the west wing, a corridor full of painted faces looked out at a darkness they had been looking out at for 200 years, patient as stone, watching the living work things out. The physical change came quietly, the way most things did when they were determined to be noticed. She had known, in the abstract, that there would be a morning when the carefully managed architecture of her situation would begin to show its cracks. What she had not anticipated was that it would feel less like a wall breaking and more like a tide, slow, steady, and completely indifferent to the plans she had arranged against it. She was in her 19th week when she realized that her standard wardrobe, the combination of layered clothing and deliberate posture that had served her well through October and into November, was beginning to require more active maintenance than she had accounted for. The clothes still managed it, mostly, but there were moments, reaching for a high shelf, leaning over the archive table, moving quickly down the corridor, when the particular quality of her movement changed in a way that she could feel, even if no one around her had given any sign of noticing it. She noticed it, and because she noticed it, she began to notice what other people were noticing. Peter was unobservant in the way that earnest young people sometimes are, fully absorbed in the thing directly in front of him, with limited peripheral attention for anything that did not immediately pertain to that thing. She was not worried about Peter. Frances, the housekeeper, was a different matter. Frances had raised 4 children, and had the particular kind of awareness that comes from years of managing other people's physical well-being. She was not intrusive. She had never asked Ilara a personal question in the 6 weeks they had known each other. But she had begun, in the past 2 weeks, to do small things, leaving a cushion for the chair in the archive, noting without fanfare that the kettle was already hot when Ilara came down in the mornings, choosing without comment the seat closest to the radiator for her at the staff dinner table. Ilara was not sure whether Frances knew, or whether Frances was simply, as some people were, attentive to the physical states of everyone around her. She filed the uncertainty and kept moving. The visiting physician arrived on a Monday in mid-November. He was a small, neat man named Dr. Aldous who came to Ashbourne quarterly to attend to any medical matters the estate staff required. Ilara had noted his scheduled visit in the estate calendar and had arranged to be fully occupied in the deepest section of the archive at the time he was expected. She had, she thought, managed it well. She had not accounted for the corridor. She was coming back from retrieving a box of documents from the upper archive, a box that was heavier than she had realized, and that she was carrying against her side rather than against her chest, because carrying things against her chest had become recently uncomfortable in a way she had not yet found a graceful solution to. When she came around the corner of the second-floor corridor and found Dr. Aldous standing there, bag in hand, finishing a conversation with Hargrove, she adjusted the box immediately. Subtly, she hoped. Dr. Aldous finished his sentence to Hargrove, and as he turned, his eyes went to her. He was a medical professional, and had the particular quality of attention that some medical professionals have. Not intrusive, not searching, simply observant, in the way that people become when they spend their working lives reading physical information. He looked at her for 1 second, perhaps 2, and his expression did not change. "Miss Voss," he said pleasantly, "I have heard good things about the archive work." "Thank you," she said, and kept moving. She did not look back. She did not change her pace. She carried the box to the archive, put it on the table, and sat down. She pressed her hands flat on the table surface and breathed. She did not know what he had seen. She did not know whether what he had seen was conclusive, or whether it was the kind of half-formed awareness that passes without action when there is no reason to pursue it. She did not know whether he would mention anything to Hargrove, or to the Duke, or whether he would do nothing at all and it would simply be another moment that passed without consequence. She sat with the uncertainty for 10 minutes. Then she opened the box and began cataloging its contents. She was good at sitting with uncertainty. She had been doing it for months. That evening was harder than most. She called Clara and kept the call light, because Clara was perceptive in the way that people who have been through difficult things become perceptive, and Alara did not want to import her anxiety into what had been a genuinely good week for her sister. She said the estate was going well, said the work was interesting, said she had been sleeping fine. All of these things were true. She did not say that she had spent the afternoon calculating what she would do if Dr. Aldous said something. She had made a list in her mind, the kind of list she always made when she needed to feel that she had command of a situation. She could ask Hargrove directly whether the physician had raised any concerns. She could take the conversation with the Duke into her own hands before someone else did. She could leave on the pretext of a family matter before anyone had the opportunity to ask. She could not leave. Not yet. She was not close enough to the amount she needed. She had another 10 weeks of salary, at minimum, that she required. She sat at the edge of her bed and did not make a decision, because not every problem required an immediate decision. Sometimes the most disciplined response was to wait and see what the next morning brought. The next morning brought nothing obvious. Hargrove was exactly as he always was. Peter arrived at the archive with a question about the land records cross-reference system she had shown him the previous week. Francis left a cup of tea outside the archive door. The day moved forward. 3 days later, she was coming down the east staircase late in the afternoon, when she passed the Duke coming up. They had developed an unconscious system of occupying the estate without colliding too often, and when they did encounter each other, it was usually brief. A nod, a specific question about the archive, an occasional comment about the gala preparations that had now moved into their final, intensive phase. He stopped on the stair below her. She stopped. He looked at her with the focused attention that was simply part of how he looked at things. "You are working too late," he said. She blinked. "I am usually in the archive until 7. "It is nearly 8. She checked her watch. It was. "I lost track," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was not quite able to read. "Hargrove said you did not come to dinner." "I was in the middle of a section. I did not want to stop." He seemed to consider this. Then he said, "There is food in the kitchen. Francis keeps something available until 9. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and continued up the stairs. She continued down. She was in the kitchen, eating the very good lamb stew that Francis had left covered on the stove when she became aware, in the particular way she was becoming increasingly aware of many things, that the margin she had left herself was narrowing. Not catastrophically. Not yet, but narrowing. She had 17 weeks remaining on her contract, of which she needed perhaps 10 to reach her financial target. At 23 weeks, she would be entering a period where the physical situation could no longer be managed by wardrobe and posture. The calculation that had seemed generous at the beginning was becoming tighter with each week that passed. She ate the stew. It was very good. She thanked Francis in her head, because Francis was always doing something quietly good, and Alara felt that it deserved acknowledgement, even in the absence of the person. She went upstairs. She did not let herself stand at the window for long, because the grounds of Ashbourne at night had a quality that she had stopped allowing herself to linger over, because lingering over it made her feel things about this place that were not part of the arrangement. She had a plan. The plan was still intact. She would make it work. She got into bed. She had been telling herself she would make it work for 4 months. She was very good at believing the things she told herself, because the alternative had always been to stop moving, and stopping was the one thing she had never been able to afford. But that night, for the first time, she lay in the dark and acknowledged to herself, quietly and without drama, that the situation had edges she had not fully mapped, that there were variables she could not fully control, that the careful architecture she had built around a difficult reality was beautiful in its construction, and not, perhaps, entirely solid. She pressed her hand against her stomach. She felt, faintly, the small movement that had first made itself known 2 weeks ago, and that still, every single time, stopped her breath for just a moment. She thought about 43 years of daily letters. She thought about a woman in a portrait who had made every decision carefully, because she had to. She thought about a man on a staircase saying, "It is nearly 8," in the tone of someone who was paying attention, without having been asked to. She closed her eyes. She told herself the plan would hold. She had been telling herself that for months, and it had been true, and she intended for it to go on being true. She slept, and the estate was quiet around her, and no one knocked on her door that night with news she was not ready for. Not yet. But the tide was coming. The autumn gala at Ashbourne Manor was exactly the kind of event that announced itself in the quality of the air before it happened. By the day of the gala, the manor had been transformed in ways both visible and invisible. The main hall, which was ordinarily a place of measured quiet and efficient movement, had become a space of carefully arranged magnificence, flowers in deep autumn colors, candles in silver holders along every mantelpiece. The large chandelier above the entrance, clean to a brightness that turned the stone floor below it into something close to glass. The staff had been moving since 6 in the morning. Ilara had kept herself in the archive for most of the day, which was where she had intended to spend the evening as well. She had not planned to attend the gala. She had planned, in fact, to spend the evening in a way that was almost ceremonial in its private significance. She had done her calculations again that morning, the way she had been doing them every 2 weeks since October, and the number she arrived at was not quite the number she needed, but it was close enough that she could see the shape of it clearly. 2 more months, perhaps 10 weeks. She needed those 10 weeks, and she had them, as long as nothing changed. She had also, somewhere in the past 4 weeks, come to a decision that she had been building toward without quite letting herself acknowledge it. She was going to leave. Not because the situation had been discovered, not because anything had gone wrong in any obvious way, but because she was 22 weeks along now, and the physical management of the secret had become something she spent energy on every hour of every day, and that energy was not unlimited, and the margin she had left herself for graceful exit was closing. She did not want to be pushed out. She wanted to leave with her own timing, her own terms, and her dignity entirely intact. She had drafted a letter to Hargrove that afternoon, a professional, complete letter, explaining that a family matter required her to end her contract early, with appropriate notice, and expressing genuine gratitude for the position and the work. She had not yet sealed it. She intended to do so that evening, while the manor was full of guests and noise, and the ordinary social machinery of the Duke's world, a world she had been standing at the edge of for 6 weeks, and had always known was not hers to enter. She was going to use the gala as a goodbye, not one that anyone else would know was a goodbye, just one that she needed, privately, for herself. She had dressed carefully, not elaborately. She did not own elaborate things, and did not wish to, but carefully. She wore the deep green dress she had brought for exactly such occasions, the one that had been chosen for its cut as much as its color, and her hair was pinned back simply, and she wore the small earrings that had been her mother's, which she put on whenever she wanted to feel steady. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. She thought about the archive. She thought about the cross-reference system she had built, which Peter now knew well enough to maintain. She thought about the 6th cabinet from the left, where she had spent 3 weeks untangling 2 generations of estate records, and had created a notation system she was genuinely proud of. She thought about the 4th Duke's letters, which she had been cataloging for the past week, and which were some of the most unexpectedly moving documents she had ever worked with. She thought about the Duke. She thought about that in the same way she thought about everything she had decided to set down, carefully, with full acknowledgement of its weight, and then firmly set down. She was not in love with Adrian Calloway. She was clear about that, because she was always clear about what was true, and what was feeling, and she knew the difference. But she had spent 6 weeks in the same building as someone who was more than she had expected him to be, and she had let herself, by degrees, feel the warmth of that in a way she had not been entirely disciplined about, and now she was choosing to leave it behind. That required acknowledgement. That required this evening. She went downstairs at 8:30, when the gala was in full progress, and the main hall was full of people, and the music had been going for an hour. She slipped in through the side entrance near the conservatory, which Hargrove had told her in passing would be open throughout the evening. She did not intend to be seen. She moved along the edge of the hall, in the shadow near the wall, and she watched. The gala was beautiful. The candles and the chandelier made the hall into something luminous. 200 guests, dressed in the careful wealth of old families, moved through the space with the ease of people accustomed to exactly this kind of evening. There was a small orchestra at the far end. There were long tables of food that Frances and her team had been preparing for 3 days. There was laughter in pockets throughout the room, and conversation, and the particular social music of a gathering going well. She found Adrian almost immediately, because he was the kind of person your eyes go to in a room without particularly trying. He was standing near the center of the hall, speaking with a group of people. 2 men of his approximate age, an older woman who carried herself with the easy authority of someone whose opinion had been sought and trusted for decades, and 2 younger women who stood together with the slightly heightened attention of people who were very aware of exactly where they were and who they were standing near. She recognized the dynamic. She had known, since Hargrove had mentioned it in his careful, uninflected way, that the gala was intended to serve more than one purpose. She had processed that without pain, because it was sensible. He needed a successor. He needed a suitable partner. He was doing what he had to do. She looked at him across the hall. She said goodbye in her mind, quietly and with a fullness that surprised her. Then the room moved. It was not a dramatic movement. It was internal and sudden, a rushing in her ears, a compression behind her eyes, the particular sensation of something in her body declining to cooperate with her plan for the evening. She had been standing for too long. She had not eaten enough at dinner, which she had taken upstairs precisely because she did not want to explain to anyone why she was dressed to go out and going nowhere. She had been on her feet since 7 in the morning, and the dress that had been chosen for its cut was holding everything in a way that required a certain amount of physical cooperation from her, and tonight, her body was simply not providing it. She reached behind her for the wall. She found the back of a chair instead. She gripped it. The room continued its slow tilt. She knew, with the part of her mind that stayed clear even when the rest of her was not, that she needed to sit down immediately, or the chair was not going to be enough. The next few seconds happened in the order in which things happen, when a body decides what will occur, regardless of what the person inside it would prefer. She felt her grip on the chair loosen. She felt the floor come up to meet her much faster than she expected, and the last clear thing she saw before the room went white and then dark was the chandelier above the hall, burning very brightly. She did not hear the music stop. She did not hear the silence that came after. She did not hear, from the far side of the hall, the sound of a conversation ending abruptly, and a set of footsteps crossing the floor with a speed and urgency that none of the 200 people watching had seen Adrian Calloway demonstrate in the entire history of their acquaintance with him. She did not see him drop to his knees beside her. She did not see anything for a little while. When she opened her eyes, the first thing she was aware of was the ceiling. It was a different ceiling than the one in the hall, lower, calmer, without the chandelier. She had been moved. She was on a settee in one of the smaller rooms off the main corridor, the one that Hargrove used for estate meetings, and that smelled of wood polish and old paper. Dr. Aldous was there, and Adrian was there. She did not immediately understand, through the fog of coming back to herself, why both of them had expressions that told her, without any words yet having been spoken, that the particular secret she had been carrying for 22 weeks was no longer hers alone. She understood when Dr. Aldous looked at her with the kind and measured expression of a man who had, in his professional life, delivered many kinds of news to many kinds of people, and said, "You are all right, Miss Voss. You and the baby are both all right." The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the distance, the orchestra had resumed. The guests had been redirected. The gala was continuing, because 200 people required management, and Hargrove was extraordinarily good at his job. In the small wood-paneled room, Dr. Aldous said a few more things. Practical things, medical things, things about rest and fluids, and the importance of not being on her feet for 10 hours at a stretch. She absorbed them without speaking. She did not look at Adrian. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about the letter she had not yet sealed. She thought about the plan, and what the plan looked like now, and whether it had any shape left to it that she could recognize. She pressed her lips together. She was not going to let her composure go in front of these people. She was not going to do that in front of Adrian Calloway, in a room where she had just been the subject of a scene she had spent 6 months working to prevent. She was not going to do that. Dr. Aldous finished. He said he would look in again before he left for the evening, and departed quietly. She and Adrian were alone. She looked at him. He was sitting in the chair across from the settee. His jacket was slightly disheveled, in a way she had never seen it before. He had been on his knees on a ballroom floor in front of 200 people, and she understood, slowly, what that meant for a man like him, in a room like that. He looked at her with an expression she had no name for yet. Not fury. Not the cold withdrawal she would have predicted. Something she did not have a category for. He said, "Are you in pain?" "No," she said. "Is anything—" He stopped. He seemed to be selecting words with more care than usual. Dr. Aldous said, "Everything is stable." "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. The words sat in the room between them. A long silence followed. She opened her mouth. She was going to explain. She had an explanation. A clear, ordered account of everything she had done and why, prepared in the part of her mind that prepared things even when she was not consciously working on them. She was going to deliver it calmly and completely, and she was going to ask nothing of him, and she was going to make it clear that she had never intended for any of this to become his concern, and that she had a plan, and that she was going to leave, and that he would not need to. "I know," he said. She stopped. "I am not. I do not need an account of it tonight," he said. "You do not need to explain anything tonight." She stared at him. He looked at her steadily. His expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, and she had been paying close attention to his expressions for 6 weeks. There was something in it that she recognized, abstractly, as a man working very hard to manage something that was not easily managed. "The first thing," he said, "is that you are all right." She swallowed. "The second thing," he said, "is that the baby is all right." She nodded. "Those are," he said, "the things that matter tonight." She did not let her composure go. She had said she would not, and she did not. But something in her chest changed its shape, quietly and without warning, in the way that things do when someone says the right words at the precise moment when wrong words would have been the easiest thing to say. She pressed her hand against her stomach, the way she always did, the private gesture that was hers alone. She had not realized, until he looked away to give her the moment, that he had seen her do it before. The clock on the mantelpiece read 20 minutes past 10. Outside the closed door, Ashbourne was full of the sounds of an evening continuing. The music, the conversation, the management of a large and complicated gathering. Inside the small wood-paneled room, 2 people who were both very good at keeping things under control sat in the quiet and did not, for once, try. He did not come to her the next morning. She had half expected him to. She had spent the night, a long night, during which she slept in fragments and lay awake in between thinking, with the kind of exhausting thoroughness that comes when your mind refuses to stop processing, going over what he had said, and what he had not said, and what either of those things might mean for the situation she now found herself in. The situation was this. She was 22 weeks pregnant. She was employed at Ashbourne on a 6-month contract. The Duke of the estate now knew about the pregnancy, as did Dr. Aldous, and very probably Hargrove, and possibly Francis. The gala had been interrupted by her collapse in front of 200 guests, and she was, by any reasonable measure, in a considerably more exposed position than she had been 24 hours earlier. She was also, physically, genuinely fine. She had eaten properly at breakfast, which was delivered to her room without her having asked for it, a gesture of Francis that she noted with gratitude. She drank all the water that was also on the tray. She lay in bed longer than she usually allowed herself. By the time she got up and dressed, her body felt like her own again, which was a significant improvement over the previous night. She went to the archive. She needed to work, not because the archive needed her urgently, although there were 3 sections still in progress, but because working was the thing she had always done when everything else was uncertain. The archive did not change based on external events. The documents required what they required, and she could give it to them, and the giving steadied her. Peter arrived at 9:30 and tried very hard not to look like he was checking on her. She told him she was well, gave him a specific task in the 3rd cabinet, and returned to her own section. They worked. The morning passed. At 11 o'clock, Hargrove appeared in the doorway. "The Duke would like to see you at your convenience," Hargrove said, with the particular neutrality of a man who had practiced neutrality for 20 years. "He is in the study." "I will come at 12, she said. Hargrove nodded and left. She worked for another 45 minutes, with the focused attention of someone making sure they are not thinking about what is coming. Then she washed her hands, put on her cardigan, and walked to the study. She knocked. He said, "Come in." She entered. He was at his desk. He rose when she came in, which she had not expected, and gestured to the chair across from his, without seeming to think about it, which was not how he usually managed the spatial architecture of their interactions. She sat. He sat. He did not begin with pleasantries, which she was grateful for, because pleasantries would have been a kind of condescension, and she suspected he knew that. "How are you this morning?" he asked. "I am well," she said, genuinely. He studied her face, as though checking the information against something internal. Then he nodded. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want you to let me finish before you respond." She folded her hands. "All right." He looked at his desk for a brief moment, and then at her, and she had the sense of someone who had spent the night, or at least part of it, arriving at the particular position he was now occupying. "You came here to do a job," he said. "You have done it excellently. Your reasons for needing this position were yours to keep, and I have no standing to judge them. What happened last night, in terms of the circumstances that were made known, was not your fault, and I have no intention of treating it as a source of difficulty for you." She kept her hands still. "I am also aware," he continued, "that you are in a situation that has practical dimensions that go beyond the immediate. You need the income from this contract. You need the remaining weeks of employment. And you are now in a position where you may feel that the situation here is untenable." He paused. "I am telling you that it is not," he said. "Your position here is unchanged, for as long as you wish it to be." She looked at him carefully. "You are not going to ask me anything about the situation." "Not today," he said, "not unless you choose to tell me." "And the staff. Hargrove is discreet to a degree that I have relied on for 22 years, he said. "Frances will take any cue I give her. Peter is not observant enough to require management. Dr. Aldous is a professional who does not discuss patients." She absorbed this. It was, she recognized, an extraordinary amount of practical protection being offered without condition. "Why?" she said. He looked at her. The question was a direct one, and she had learned that he responded to direct questions more honestly than to indirect ones, even when honesty cost him something. "Because last night," he said, carefully, "I crossed the floor of my own ballroom in front of everyone I know, and it did not occur to me, not for 1 second, to think about what any of them were seeing. It occurred to me, only to get to you." He stopped. He looked at his desk again briefly, then back at her. "That is information about myself that I did not expect to have, and I am still working out what it means. But it seemed relevant to your question." The study was very quiet. She had not prepared for honesty of that order. She had prepared for management, for reasonable professional courtesy, for the politely framed version of "please keep this contained and do your work and we will not discuss it further." She had not prepared for someone telling her the truth about themselves in the plain, slightly uncomfortable way of a person to whom truth came more easily than comfort. She looked at the desk. She looked at her hands. She thought about 43 years of daily letters, and a woman in a portrait who had made every decision carefully because she had to, and a man on a staircase at 8:15 who had noticed, without comment, that she had missed dinner. "The child's father is not in the picture," she said. "He has not been since October." Adrian said nothing. He simply listened. "I have a sister who has been ill," she said. "The income from this position is paying for her care. I was aware, when I accepted the contract, of the timing of my situation. I had calculated that I could manage it without it affecting my work or becoming a problem for the estate." "Your work has not been affected," he said. "No," she said, "but the rest of it has reached its natural limit," he said. "Yes." A pause. "You were going to leave before it became visible." She looked at him. She had not said that. "You mentioned, 3 weeks ago, that you had drafted a letter to Hargrove about a family matter that might require early termination of your contract. he said. You did not send it. She had mentioned that, briefly, in passing, as a hypothetical. She had not known he was paying that close attention. I was going to send it last night, she said. Before the gala. I know, he said. The word sat there. She did not argue with it. She thought about the plan that had been so carefully built and so steadily maintained, and that had finally, in the middle of a ballroom floor, given way not to discovery, but to simple, physical reality. She thought about what the next weeks looked like now, not alone, not managed in secret, but held, however unexpectedly, by circumstances she had not created and could not have predicted. She thought about a man crossing a room without thinking, without calculating, just crossing it. I would like to stay, she said. If the position is genuinely available, I would like to finish what I started. He looked at her with the expression she had first noted in the portrait gallery, the one that was not cold, not distant, but contained, in the way of someone who holds things carefully rather than carelessly. The position is yours, he said. She nodded. She stood to leave. At the door, she paused, because there was one thing she had not said, and that she thought she owed him. The archive system will hold without me, she said. Peter understands most of it, but the Fourth Duke's letters still need 2 more weeks of work, and the Eastern land records have a sequence issue I have not yet resolved. I would like to finish both before I go, whenever that is. All right, he said. She walked back to the archive. She sat down at the table, opened the notebook, and looked at the page of cross-references she had been working on that morning. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her mind was clear in the way it got, when something that had been heavy was set down. She had not set it down entirely, but someone was holding part of it. She began to work. In the study, Adrian sat at his desk for several minutes without opening any of the correspondence that was waiting for him. Then he picked up the telephone and called Gerald Fenn. The meeting with the Hartley family, he said, the one scheduled for the 3rd week of December. Yes, said Fenn. Cancel it, Adrian said. A pause. The Thornton meeting as well? Cancel them all, Adrian said. Another pause, longer. Of course, Fenn said, in the tone of a man who was not going to ask. Adrian thanked him. He put the phone down. He looked at the window. Outside, the November grounds of Ashbourne stretched in every direction, bare-limbed now, the last of the autumn color gone to ground. The oak trees stood where they had always stood. The fountain had been turned off for the winter. The lawns were the quiet gray-green of a season settling in. He had 17 years of careful decision-making behind him. 17 years of keeping emotion out of every significant choice he had ever made, because emotion was the thing that had destroyed the generation before him, and had nearly destroyed the estate he spent his life rebuilding. He had crossed a ballroom floor in front of everyone he knew. He had not, even for a moment, thought about anything except getting to her. He sat with that a while longer. Then he opened the correspondence and got back to work. Gerald Fenn sent 3 separate emails over the following week, each one phrased with increasing professional delicacy, about the implications of the cancelled family meetings and the timeline the Duke had previously established with the royal court. Adrian read each one and responded with the same answer. He was aware. He would be in touch when his thinking had clarified. He was aware. He was also, in the private way that certain realizations require time to settle, thinking. It was not that he was unaware of what the letter from the court meant. He had known, before the gala, what was expected and what the plan had been. He had constructed that plan with the same deliberate care he brought to everything. He had simply, at some point in the past 6 weeks, stopped living in it. He had not noticed the moment it happened. That was the thing. He was a man who noticed things. It was, in some ways, his primary professional and personal skill. He noticed details in accounts that other people glossed over. He noticed the specific weight of correspondence, the significance of what was not said as much as what was. He noticed when Hargrove had had a difficult night, and when the East Lawn was draining too slowly, and when a family letter was out of sequence with its own content. He had noticed Alara Voss walking down a corridor at 11 in the evening, carrying a box that was too heavy, slightly too carefully. He had noticed the way she listened, completely, with the whole of her attention, and then answered with the same completeness. He had noticed the green notebook and the handwriting that was small and extremely legible, and the way she held a pen. He had noticed that she called someone every evening at around 9 o'clock, and that she always smiled during those calls, the particular private smile of someone who is genuinely glad to be talking to the person they are talking to. He had noticed all of this the way you notice things that matter, which is to say, without deciding to, and without quite realizing, until you are standing in front of 200 people and none of them exist in any real sense, that the noticing has been telling you something for weeks. He was not a man given to romantic ideas about things. He did not use the vocabulary of feeling easily, and he was aware that his own inner life was not a place he navigated with any particular grace. But he was an honest person, at minimum in his private dealings with himself, and honesty required that he acknowledge what the previous 24 hours had clarified. He went to the archive on a Thursday afternoon, 3 days after the conversation in the study. She was at the table where she usually worked, the green notebook open beside her, and several documents spread across the surface, in the organized pattern he had come to recognize as her working arrangement. She looked up when he came in. She did not look alarmed. She had stopped looking alarmed when he came in, somewhere around week 2, and she had not started again. He found this, as he found most things about her, both specific and significant. "I wanted to ask," he said, staying near the door rather than taking the chair, because he was not sure yet if this was a door conversation or a chair conversation. "How you are?" "I am well," she said, "better this week than last." "Good." A pause. He remained near the door. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. "I canceled the meetings with the families." She looked at him steadily. "I see," she said. "I canceled all of them," he said. "The social outreach, the structured process. I ended it." She set her pen down. "Is that a practical decision?" "No," he said. "It is not a practical decision at all." She looked at him for a moment, with the expression she had worn in the portrait gallery, open and unassuming, gathering information. "Then what kind of decision is it?" she said. He crossed the room, because it had turned out to be a chair conversation after all, and sat. He did not look at the documents on the table, he looked at her. "It is the kind," he said carefully, "that I am not accustomed to making. That is why I wanted to tell you, rather than wait for it to become apparent through circumstance. I did not want it to be something you heard secondhand and did not understand the meaning of." She was quiet for a moment. "I am not asking you for anything," he said, quickly and clearly, because he was not a man who liked to be misunderstood on the point of what he was asking for. "I am not proposing anything, or expecting anything. I am simply telling you that the thing I had been working toward before you arrived here is no longer something I am working toward, and I want you to know the reason." She picked up her pen. She looked at it for a moment. "What is the reason?" she said. He looked at her. "Because," he said, "I went to look for the Hanley letter, and it was exactly where you said it would be." She looked up. He met her eyes. He did not smile. He rarely smiled, but there was something in his expression that was the closest he came to it, in the way that contained people express warmth, not outwardly, but in the particular quality of their attention. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked down at the document in front of her, and something crossed her face that was also not quite a smile, and was also unmistakably warm. "The Eastern Land Records," she said, returning to the document. "I found the sequence issue this morning. It is in the 1920s correspondence. Someone filed the response before the original letter, and it has been causing a gap in the timeline since approximately 1987. "How do you know it is 1987? He said. "Because that is when the last catalog reference was made, and the error was not caught," she said. "Which means whoever did the 1987 catalog was either rushed or unqualified." "Rushed," he said. "The estate was in the middle of a financial crisis." "That explains it," she said. "They worked. He stayed for 2 hours. He did not pretend he was there for any professional purpose, and she did not ask him to justify his presence. And Peter arrived at 4 o'clock, and looked between them with the particular wide-eyed expression of someone whose peripheral awareness had, for once, fully engaged, and then went very quietly to his section, and said nothing whatsoever. That evening, Hargrove set 2 places for dinner in the small dining room that Adrian used on ordinary evenings, rather than the one at the main table. He said nothing about it. Adrian said nothing about it. Alara arrived downstairs at 7 and found both places set, and sat down, and the soup was brought in, and dinner was eaten. It was a very ordinary dinner. It was, in the quiet way of things at Ashbourne, not ordinary at all. December arrived with the cold, clean certainty of a season that has been on its way for a long time and does not apologize for finally appearing. Frost came to the grounds in the mornings now, turning the lawns silver before the pale winter sun burned it off by mid-morning. The oak trees stood bare. The herb garden outside Alara's window had gone dormant. The fountain, silent since November, had a thin skin of ice across its surface that caught the light in the early hours. Alara noticed all of this, the way she noticed things, carefully, and with a kind of involuntary appreciation that she had stopped pretending she did not feel. She was in her 25th week. The physical situation was no longer something that wardrobe and posture could manage, and so she had stopped managing it. The estate knew. The small world of Ashbourne had reorganized itself around this fact with the quiet efficiency of a household that took its cues from its head, and its head had given no indication that the situation was a problem. Frances had, without ceremony, adjusted her approach to meals. Hargrove had reorganized the schedule of deliveries so that Alara did not need to manage heavy boxes. Peter had developed the touching habit of appearing whenever there was anything to be lifted, and lifting it without being asked. The Duke had had a conversation with Alara in the small dining room, 3 days after their exchange in the archive. That was the most direct conversation she had ever had with another person about her own situation. He had not asked her to explain herself. He had asked, instead, what she needed. She had told him, with the complete honesty she had decided she owed him, what the financial situation actually was. The loan, the medical costs, the amount remaining, the target she had been working toward. He had listened with full attention and without expression. He had then said that the contract would be paid in full through its remaining term, regardless of her working status, and that she was to stop carrying the financial concern as something she managed alone. She had looked at him for a long moment after he said that. She had said, "That is very generous." He had said, "It is straightforward." They had gone back to their soup. What was not straightforward, what was in fact the opposite of straightforward in every possible respect, was the thing that had been growing in the small dining room, and the archive, and the portrait gallery, and the east staircase, and the Thursday afternoon corridors of Ashbourne for weeks. It had no name yet, at least not one that either of them had used aloud. It had, instead, the quality of something real, not performed, not strategic, not arrived at by any plan that either of them had made. She had not planned to come here and find someone. She had been explicitly, determinedly planning the opposite. He had not planned to find anyone, except through the careful, structured process he had put in motion, and then, quietly, cancelled. They had both, in their separate ways, been building against the kind of complication that the other person now represented. Neither of them talked about it in those terms. But neither of them avoided the dining room either, and neither of them made the archive a professional space only. And when they walked through the portrait gallery on a Sunday morning in early December, not for any particular purpose, simply because she had mentioned a letter that referenced a painting, and they had both gone to look at it, and then stayed. And he described the fourth Duke's marriage, in the particular restrained way he described things he cared about. She had turned to look at his profile and thought, with sudden clarity, "This is a man I trust." She had not trusted Owen. She realized that now, in the way that you realize things about the past when the present gives you a clearer angle. She had liked him. She had enjoyed his company. She had told herself she trusted him, because she had wanted to trust someone, and he had seemed like a reasonable candidate. She had not, actually, ever felt the specific thing that she felt watching Adrian Calloway examine a 140-year-old painting, with the focused attention of someone who considered everything worth considering. She trusted him. That was, she understood, significant. The solicitor's visit happened on a Wednesday. She found out because Hargrove mentioned, with his characteristic oblique economy, that Mr. Hartley the solicitor would be in for the morning, and that the Duke had asked whether she would be available to meet with him at 11 if she was not engaged in anything critical. Hargrove said it with no particular inflection. She recognized this as Hargrove's inflection for something that was not casual. She said she would be available at 11. Mr. Hartley was a small, silver-haired man of about 60, with the air of someone who had spent his career dealing with sensitive matters and had developed a deep professional contentment with keeping them contained. He met with Adrian first, for 40 minutes. Then Hargrove brought Alara to the study. Adrian was at his desk. He rose again when she entered. She noted, again, that this was something he did now without seeming to think about it. "I wanted to speak with you before you met with Mr. Hartley," he said, "because I should have spoken with you before I began this process, and I did not, and I am correcting that now." She stood in the center of the room and waited. "I have asked Mr. Hartley to draw up documentation," he said, "that would extend formal recognition and legal protection of Ashbourne to you and to the child." She said nothing. "Not as a condition," he said, quickly and clearly. "Not as an expectation, not in exchange for anything. Simply because you are here, and because the child will exist in this world, and because the notion of either of you being without protection, that I am in a position to provide, is not something I intend to tolerate." She looked at him. "Adrian," she said. It was the first time she had used his name without the title, and she saw him register it. "What are you doing?" He looked at her directly. He did not look away, or qualify what he was about to say. "I am doing," he said, "what I should have said more plainly some time ago. I am telling you that whatever arrangement this is, this thing between us, which I do not know exactly what to call, and which I am aware has no ordinary shape, I would like it to continue. I am telling you that I have no interest in managing a succession with someone I do not know, and that I have, without particularly planning it, found myself in the position of knowing someone whose presence in this house has made the house different in a way I do not want it to stop being." She absorbed this carefully, the way she always absorbed things. "You are not proposing," she said. "I am not proposing," he said. "I am telling you that I would like to, when it makes sense. When you are ready for that question, I am telling you it is in me to ask." The study was quiet. Outside the window, frost still lay along the garden borders where the sun had not reached yet. She thought about the letter she had never sent. She thought about the plan she had built so carefully, and how it had given way not to failure, but to something she had not had a name for, and how she now had one. She thought about trust. "The documentation," she said. "Tell me what it covers." He told her. She listened with full attention, asked 3 specific questions that Mr. Hartley answered from his notes through the open door, and absorbed the practical reality of what was being offered with the same care she had always brought to practical realities. When it was done, she said, "I will sign it." Mr. Hartley gathered his papers with the quiet efficiency of a man who had drawn up many documents in his career, and considered this one, privately, among the more gratifying. Adrian walked her back to the archive. At the door, he stopped. She stopped. "I should tell you," he said, "that I have no experience doing any of this well." "Doing what?" she said. "Any of it," he said, "the general direction of things, as they currently stand." She looked at him. She almost smiled, and he saw it, and the thing in his expression that was not quite a smile appeared again. "Neither do I," she said, "but I have found that the approach that works best for me is to be thorough and to not assume I already know what the documents contain before I have read them." He looked at her for a moment. "That," he said, "is reasonable advice." She went into the archive. He stood in the corridor for a brief moment longer, with the expression of a man who has just received something he had not been sure he would be given, and is still working out what to do with the fullness of it. Then he went back to his study, called Gerald Fenn, and told him that the court correspondence could be handled directly through Mr. Hartley going forward. Fenn said, "I see," in the tone of a man who did, in fact, see. Adrian thanked him and hung up. Outside, the December frost was burning off the garden, and the estate was quiet and clear, and somewhere in the archive on the other side of the building, a woman he had not expected was doing the work she had come to do, and it was very good work. She was still there in the evening. He knew because the light in the archive window was on when he walked the east path at 5 o'clock, and it stayed on past 7, and he did not say anything about it, because it was her light, and her work, and her choice. But he made sure Frances left enough for 2 at dinner. The child was born on a Tuesday, in the first week of February, at 20 minutes past 3 in the morning. She came into the world with a particular decisiveness, loud, present, immediately and completely herself, that surprised everyone except Ilara, who had spent the preceding 8 months being gradually educated in the ways of a person who did not especially care about your plans and had her own. She had dark eyes. She had very little hair. She had a way of looking at the ceiling that suggested she had opinions about it. Ilara held her first, for as long as the doctors permitted, and felt the particular reconfiguration of the world that everyone describes and that cannot, regardless of the description, be fully anticipated. It was not a gentle reconfiguration. It was thorough and complete, like the reorganization of an archive that has been miscategorized for years and is finally being given its proper structure. Adrian came in when he was permitted. Dr. Aldous had been present throughout. A quiet, efficient, steady presence, and the midwife had come from the village with the confidence of someone who had done this many times in many houses and had seen a great deal without losing her warmth. Hargrove had kept himself available in the corridor without being asked. Francis had kept the kitchen going through the night and appeared at intervals with things that were needed. Adrian came to the bedside and looked at the child. He was quiet for a long time. Ilara watched him look at her daughter and thought about everything that had happened in the months since October, and the way things that begin as plans dissolve into something more true when you stop maintaining them with such effort. "She looks decided," he said finally. "She is," Ilara said. He looked at Ilara then. He had the expression she had first understood in the portrait gallery, contained, but not cold, careful, full of something he did not often show, and had been, by degrees, allowing her to see. "What is her name?" he said. "Clara," Ilara said, "for my sister." He nodded. He looked at Clara. Clara, with her dark eyes and her opinions about the ceiling, was unimpressed by the size of her new world and appeared to be planning what to do about it. "Hello, Clara," Adrian said, quietly and without ceremony, in the same tone he used when he was looking at something he considered worth his full attention. The following weeks were not simple. They were also not what Ilara had expected simplicity or difficulty to look like, because she had expected both of those things to be external forces, and found instead that they came from inside, from the daily calibration of learning, to let someone else hold part of what she had been carrying alone for so long. Adrian was not a man who adjusted to new things quickly, but he was a man who, once he decided something was worth doing, did it with the full weight of his character. He read 3 books on infant care in the first week, which was not particularly useful in the practical sense, but told her something significant about how he processed information he felt responsible for. He moved his working hours to accommodate the reality of a house with a newborn, without announcing that he had done it. He developed a specific, slightly careful way of holding Clara that she came to recognize as his version of confidence, not natural ease, but the determined practice of something he intended to get right. She watched him work at it and thought about the word trust again. The legal documentation that Mr. Hartley had drawn up in December had been signed and filed. It was, in its language, comprehensive. It was also, she understood, the foundation of something rather than the thing itself. The thing itself did not have a name yet, in the official sense. There had been no formal proposal. Adrian had told her, in the study, that he would like to ask when the time was right, and he had not pressed the point since, and she had understood this as the most respectful thing he could have done, giving her the time to arrive at something she arrived at herself, rather than something that had been managed for her. She arrived at it on a Thursday evening in March. She was in the archive, working on the 4th Duke's letters, which she had nearly finished by then. Clara was asleep in the small room that had been adapted, quickly and efficiently, into a nursery on the 2nd floor. Adrian was at his desk in the study. It was an ordinary evening at Ashbourne, with the particular quality that ordinary evenings at Ashbourne had acquired. A settled, lived-in warmth that was different from the careful quiet the house had held when she first arrived. She read a sentence in one of the 4th Duke's letters to his wife. She had read thousands of his sentences by that point. This one said, simply, that he had come home that evening, and the house had been full of her voice before he had even reached the door, and that he had stood in the corridor for a moment, just to hear it, because a house that held that voice was different from a house that did not, and he had no interest in the second kind. She read it twice. She put down the letter, walked down the corridor, and knocked on the study door. Adrian said, "Come in." She came in. He was at his desk, reading something from Fenn. He looked up. He put the document down without looking at it. She came to stand in the middle of the room. "I think," she said, "that you should ask the question." He was very still for a moment. "Now?" he said. "Now," she said. He stood. He came around the desk. He stood in front of her in the way he stood when he was paying full attention, without fidgeting, without looking away, with the complete, slightly unnerving focus that had once struck her as controlled and she now understood was simply how he loved things. He asked the question. She said yes. There was no dramatic moment. There was no orchestra. There were no guests. There was just the study at Ashbourne in the evening, with the lamp on the desk and the papers of an estate that had been built back from nearly nothing, and two people who had each arrived at the other by a route so specific and unlikely that it could not have been planned. He held her hands. She did not pull them away. He looked at her with the expression she had been learning for months, the one that was not cold and not performed and not managed, just real. They stood like that for a while. Downstairs, Hargrove was in the kitchen, and Frances was somewhere in the west wing, and Clara was asleep in the room that had been made for her with no particular planning and a great deal of care. The grounds of Ashbourne stretched outside in the dark, and the fountain had been turned back on with the turning of the season, and the oak trees stood where they had always stood, patient and permanent, and utterly indifferent to the specific miracle of two people choosing each other in an ordinary room on an ordinary evening. The court received its documentation in April. Mr. Hartley managed it with the discreet efficiency he brought to everything. The letter of acknowledgement arrived on a Tuesday, addressed to the Duke of Ashbourne, noting that the line of succession had been confirmed to the Crown's satisfaction, and no further action was required. Adrian read it at his desk. He put it in the appropriate folder. He went to the archive, where Alara was finishing the last section of the fourth Duke's letters, and told her. She looked up from the document she was working on. "Good," she said. "Yes," he said. He sat down at the end of the table. Clara, in the small chair that had been placed near the archive window, because the light was good there, and she had made her preferences about light clear, made a noise of no particular significance. Adrian looked at her. She looked back at him with the solemn, complete attention of someone sizing up an opponent and finding them possibly acceptable. "She has your eyes," he said. "She has your own eyes," Alara said. "She was simply kind enough to make them look like mine." He considered this. He did not dispute it. He reached over and retrieved the letter he had been intending to look up, a piece of 1910 correspondence that had a cross-reference notation in Alara's handwriting directing him to the fourth cabinet. He had been meaning to pull it for days. He pulled it now and settled in and read. Alara went back to the fourth Duke's final letter to his wife, written 3 months before his death, describing in the fourth Duke's plain, careful, attentive way the ordinary events of an ordinary day on the estate. The light on the morning lawn, the specific sound that the east gate made when the wind came from the south, the way his wife had laughed at something over breakfast that he could not now remember but had been glad to hear, the fact that he had stood in the corridor for a moment and listened to the house, which held the voice he had loved for 43 years, and thought how different it was from a house that did not. She finished transcribing it. She closed the notebook. Outside the archive window, the Ashbourne grounds lay in the clean light of an April morning, still and green and unhurried, as they had been for 200 years. Clara made another noise, more decisive this time. Adrian set down his letter and looked at her. "She has something to say," he said. "She always does," said Alara. And she did.